Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Keith Darden, a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia and Ukraine. And his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. Welcome to Background Briefing, Keith Darden.
Thanks. It's nice to be back on.
Well, thank you. And the president, of course, has made a big deal about how he sees Ukraine as being irredeemably corrupt. Recently he said, I don't care about politics, but I do care about corruption. And this whole thing is about corruption. This whole thing is about corruption. But in spite of what he's saying, the Trump administration has been cutting billions of dollars from programs that fight corruption, and specifically in Ukraine itself, cutting the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement program that was helping Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, cutting money from the Economic Support and Development Fund for Ukraine. And in 2018, the Ukrainians were getting $250 million. The White House cut it down to $145 million, and so forth. So the numbers don't lie, but the president does, it would seem.
It certainly would. And in fact, in his phone call, where we have the transcript with President Zelensky from July, he never mentions corruption. He mentions these specific cases. He mentions, investigating Joe Biden and his son. He, mentions investigating CrowdStrike and the conspiracy theory about the influence on the U.S. elections in 2016. Never says anything about corruption. This is all after the fact, trying to create a rationale for the things that he did.
Well, yesterday I spoke with a former federal prosecutor who did a lot of RICO work, particularly going after the Brighton Beach Russian mob and the Little Odessa mob. And we talked about this character, Lev Parnas, along with Igor Fruman, who were the two that were trying to leave town, were caught at Dallas International with one-way tickets out of the U.S. And the Wall Street Journal has shown their Instagram file online with thousands of pictures of them with Trump and particularly with Rudy Giuliani. They actually were having breakfast with Rudy Giuliani before they went to the airport and were arrested. But Lev Parnas apparently has got an awful long rap sheet, and he goes back to Brighton Beach in the 70s and the 80s. Apparently he was the biggest donor to Rudy Giuliani's mayoral campaign. And it looks like what he does, even though he's got a trail of bankruptcies and lawsuits against him, for a guy that's in economic trouble all the time, and a couple down in Florida is suing him for $500,000 for a movie that never got made, he's nevertheless able to donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to Trump's political campaigns and PACs, along with Rudy Giuliani. So what's going on there? I mean, is this guy a cutout for Firtash? It certainly looks that way.
It certainly does. He was employed apparently as a translator for Firtash's lawyers. And that seems like clearly you can get a more professional translator than Lev Parnas to translate for Firtash in his conversations with his lawyers in the United States. So this looks like a variety of ways in which he's getting money from somebody else, that he is some kind of intermediary, either for Firtash or for the bigger boss, which is a guy named Semyon Mogilevich, he was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He's seen as the ultimate boss, the boss of bosses of the Russian crime world.
So in the big picture, though, with what's going on now with this scandal over Ukraine and Trump's phone call with the President Zelensky, which has led to an impeachment probe, which is obviously going to lead to an impeachment. And there's been some fairly strong testimony coming this last week from former NSC people like Fiona Hill, who was in charge of Russia and Ukraine, along with Ambassador Bill Taylor, who apparently was extremely convincing, and very much so apparently with the Republicans on the committee, in spite of the fact that they got great cash yesterday by the Tea Party Republicans. Apparently they nevertheless were apparently quite influenced by Taylor's presentation, even though the White House press secretary called him a radical bureaucrat.
Yeah, radical unelected bureaucrat.
That's a good one. So But the bigger picture here seems to be that Ukraine was a cash cow for oligarchs and others ripping off the gas market, and that was broken up with Maidan to some extent by getting rid of Yanukovych. Not that the others before them weren't also, including the opposition leader. She also was in on it. They all were in on it. The new guy comes in and tries to clean it up. And then what happens, the Trump administration send over the Secretary of Energy and Lev Parnas and his partner Fruman, and they try to stack the board of Naftogaz, the state gas monopoly, with cronies from the past. So the U.S. is really exporting corruption to a country that's trying to clean up corruption.
That's right. In fact, the Obama administration had worked very hard to get a reasonable international board for Naftogaz, the Ukrainian state gas company, because that was the primary way in which people were siphoning billions of dollars out of the Ukrainian state, right, in cooperation with the Russians, right? And so Dmytro Firtash, who you mentioned a moment ago, who hired Lev Parnas, was the primary beneficiary of that old gas trade, and his influence was cut from that board, cut from Naftogaz, and cut from the intermediary trading corporation that was siphoning money from the Russian-Ukrainian gas trade. And he was clearly trying to get, his hands back on that money spigot. And so trying to replace the members of the international board that would of Naftogaz that would put a stop to some of the criminal activities that were taking place and put new people on there. And that raised tremendous red flags on the Ukrainian side, I have to say. There was an AP report yesterday how, very early after Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine back in May, he had a meeting with his advisors, and they were already concerned about pressure from the United States government to change the board membership of Naftogaz in a way that would have corrupted the company again.
And again, I'm speaking with Keith Darden, who's a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia and Ukraine, and his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. So the bigger picture then appears to be that the important player here in terms of the Trump administration and the campaign and this connection to this cash cow that everyone wants to milk, the Ukrainian gas market, it has to be, it would seem, that it has to be Paul Manafort. And of course he was working directly for the kleptocratic leader Yanukovych. And he, of course, his right-hand man was a GRU officer, Konstantin Kilimnik. So the connections are tight, both milking the money, and we know how much money Manafort was milking, but also the political directions, if you will, coming from Russia. He's obviously in jail. He's not saying a word. But has Rudy Giuliani replaced him? Is that how it's working out now? It just seems that they're still connected to Ukraine. I mean, somebody once said if you shake a tree with Trump, a Russian falls out. Well, not only a Russian falls out, but a Ukrainian falls out. And
a Ukrainian more often than not falls out, right?
Right. So. And a crooked one that's tied to Russia.
That's right. So Giuliani, there are reports that he's been in contact with Paul Manafort to help navigate that Ukrainian terrain as well. But yes, he's largely replaced Manafort as this intermediary between the Ukrainian oligarchs and some of the corrupt officials and the Trump campaign in a way, and also gas and oil interests in the United States. So that's partly why Rick Perry, its Secretary of Energy, was getting involved, was because there is money to be made on the Ukrainian gas trade, and there were several people on our side that wanted to make that money. But Giuliani, absolutely, he's been making money in Ukraine. He was hired by an oligarch from the eastern part of Ukraine, from Kharkov, a guy named Pavel Fuchs, to do cybersecurity, right? Which is clearly not something that Ukrainians need our help with. Certainly not Giuliani's help, but he's paid handsomely for that. And the Ukrainians are used to trading seats on boards, paying consulting fees as a way of bribing people and buying influence in Washington, and that's always going to be useful to Ukrainians. And on the American side, extracting large sums of money out of the Ukrainian market is clearly something that a lot of people have become wealthy doing. Paul Manafort, Rudy Giuliani, and many others.
But it seems like Ambassador William Taylor is the opposite. He was a guy that was brought out of retirement. He'd already been an ambassador to Ukraine. He was somebody that really cared about the Ukrainian people, that was incredibly popular, and was working very hard to encourage transparency and to fight corruption. And I imagine he was really greatly relieved that Zelensky got elected on a cleanup campaign, an anti-corruption campaign, with a massive mandate from the people. There's no question that the Ukrainian people want to get rid of the grip of the oligarchs and clean up. And that's pretty much, I think, what the testimony that Taylor was giving is, here I am working in the name of the United States government to help protect and defend this country from Russian aggression, at the same time try and clean up and root out the corruption. And I'm finding out that my own government has a shadow foreign ministry, if you will, doing the opposite.
Yeah, everybody should read Ambassador Taylor's opening statement to the committee. It's about 15 pages long, and every word is worth reading. It's incredibly detailed. The man is he's a blue chip public servant. West Point grad, served as an officer in 101st Airborne in Vietnam. 25, 30 years of service in the diplomatic corps. He knows Ukraine extremely well, and his statement about Ukraine, that this was the beginning of a new era potentially for Ukraine. That this was, both on the identity politics stuff, because Zelensky was committed to bridging the sort of Russian-speaking versus Ukrainian-speaking divide within the country, and especially on the corruption. As somebody who's followed the country for decades, he was really well positioned to see what a critical moment this was, and to see how it was effectively being spoiled by what he calls the informal, irregular channel of policy making that went through Rudy Giuliani rather than through the official State Department channels. It's really tragic. And there were people like Kurt Volker, the special envoy, who also collaborated in that informal channel, as did Gordon Sondland. So it wasn't purely outside the offices of the diplomatic corps, but it was certainly taken out of official channels, and these guys were kind of doing it freelancing on their own. There's a reason why John Bolton referred to it as a drug deal in his conversations with Fiona Hill, which she testified to before the committee.
But the other testimony that was damning came from George Cantor, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. And what he told the congressional committees looking into this impeachment inquiry was that both Putin and the Hungarian leader Orban had poisoned Trump's view of the new Ukrainian president, Zelensky. That they were trashing him. Everybody knows that he was the man of the people, in terms of, that was the name of his TV show, and literally life imitated art. And the man of the people was an ordinary guy that gets elected president and is honest and tries to clean up corruption. And it turns out that that's exactly what happened in real life, with a massive mandate. Nobody's ever said a bad word about this guy, except apparently Orban and Putin poisoned Trump before he even made the July 25th phone call. And apparently, again, Bolton and Fiona Hill tried to stop Trump and Mulvaney from gifting Orban, this despot, from a state visit to the United States, to the White House.
Yeah. So, it's really par for the course for this presidency that, he's established ties and rewarded non-democratic leaders with visits to the White House, summit meetings, favorable press, and if you're a Democratic leader, if you're Angela Merkel, if you're Vladimir Zelensky, you're disparaged, and you have a very hard time getting U.S. backing and support. And so, Yes, I mean, I actually don't think that Trump cares much about Ukraine either way, and that he didn't necessarily get persuaded one way or another by Orban or Putin. He just sees Ukraine as a vehicle for influencing our domestic politics. That this is just a way of using something that was under his control, which was the release of $391 million of military assistance, to get the Ukrainians to do a favor for him politically, which was, opening an investigation into his primary political rival, Joe Biden. And, that is that's out of the authoritarian leader's toolkit, right? That's using the state, using the power, the offices of the state, the money of the state, for your own political purposes and your own political ends. That's not something we should ever see in a democracy.
But do you think that that point can be made, because that's at the heart of this impeachment inquiry, and apparently they're going to...
It should be, yes.
That's what they're going to narrow it down to, this one case, which to most people that know about the law and international relations and the U.S. Constitution know is that Trump has violated the Constitution and is therefore impeachable. But the American people at large don't necessarily know that. Is there a way that they can be educated? Because the amazing thing about the Republicans is that they can literally fixate on lies and get so much mileage out of fictions, like Benghazi. Look how much mileage they got out of that. Remember Hillary Clinton's emails? Well, the State Department's long investigation into her emails just closed with finding absolutely nothing. Not a peep's coming from the Republicans, but they milk that one for all they are worth. So there's a disparity here. The Republicans are great at milking fictions and lies that they make up and beating the drum and creating a reality out of nonsense. But the Democrats don't seem to be very good about presenting the truth and the evidence that backs up the truth.
I think they've been confusing the issue by talking about this as foreign interference in our elections. The extent to which Ukraine was interfering in our elections is because they were coerced to interfere in our elections, because they, were having $391 million, which they desperately needed, held back from them in order to get them to open an investigation that would interfere in our elections. This is not really a story about foreign interference in our elections. It's about the abuse of power, right? So authoritarian regimes, the leaders of those authoritarian regimes, get to use the resources of the state to influence their elections. Lots of authoritarian regimes have competitive elections. Putin has competitive elections. Orban has competitive elections. The difference in an authoritarian regime, as opposed to a democracy, is that the leader gets to use the state to manipulate that outcome. They get to investigate their opponents. They get to, use their control over the media, over the regulatory apparatus to influence the outcome, to tilt the playing field in their favor. We have studiously avoided that in the United States, right? The Hatch Act prevents U.S. Federal officials from participating in political campaigns. The FBI, after 1972, was essentially prevented from conducting political investigations of political figures because J. Edgar Hoover had abused that so badly. We have really been careful not to let that happen. Now, nobody thought this could happen with foreign assistance, right? This is a Trump innovation, really. The idea that that's the part of the bureaucracy that, that money is something that you could use to, get another country to conduct a politicized investigation that was going to help your campaign. And I think the Democrats can make this point, right? I think that the Democrats can say this is really about using the resources of the state, the office of the presidency, not for the national interest, but for Trump's personal political interest. And that is something that is against the law, and rightly so in a democracy, because it's what makes democracies die very quickly.
Well, Keith Darden, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Keith Darden, who's a professor in the School of International Service at American University, where his research focuses on nationalism, state building, and the politics of Russia and Ukraine. And his forthcoming book is Resisting Occupation in Eurasia. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into turmoil in South America, from Chile to Haiti, from Ecuador to Bolivia.